Hello, my name is Dr. Weiss, and I'm going to be providing information. This PowerPoint is about immigration and movement. This, I think, is a very important topic, whether or not we're discussing a literary text or current events or history or whatnot. And I put together this PowerPoint to introduce some contemporary novels about immigration. However, I also teach early 19th century or 19th century and early 20th century literature, and this is also a period of the literature of immigration. And many of the slides that I use for this presentation and for presentation on earlier immigration are essentially the same. There are a lot of similarities between what is going on today in terms of immigration, what immigration means and its effects, as it has in historical contexts. So let's get started. Why do people move? Why do people move from one place to another? People move because of the various conditions, because of various kinds of oppression, violence, which we're going to take a little bit closer look at in a moment, because of human rights or the absence of human rights, for political reasons, religious reasons, maybe an absence of economic opportunities, an absence of educational opportunities, because of natural disasters. People move from one place to another because of singular events that take place that make living there impossible to do so, and also because of chronic or long-term deficiencies in various systems that facilitate their movement from one place to another. Just a couple of terms. An immigrant is a person who seeks permanent residence elsewhere. An asylum seeker seeks new permanent residency based on a native country's political conditions, or a refugee, a displaced person forced to leave one's native country. There are also other sort of designations, and what's important about these various designations is they're not all legal designations. So for instance, a term that has been developed, it was developed in the 1970s but has been gaining more traction in the last 5 or 10 years, is the environmental refugee. Is this a legal category? Not really, but this is a category to sort of describe why a person, a family, a group of people might move from one region to another because of what's going on in terms of the environment. And we're going to take a look at that as well. In fact, we're going to do that right now. Climate. Because of droughts, sea level changes, and these might cause an inability to grow food, an absence of clean water, disease, extreme weather patterns. I have two images here. The image over my left shoulder is a heat map of the world, and there are places today and more places in the next 30 to 50 years, 30 to the next 100 years, that will be inhospitable to human habitation, that there are people that live there today. Where are these people going to go? The image on the bottom right-hand side is an image of an island in Polynesia that is disappearing because of rising sea levels. If we think about islands all over the world, where are these people going to go if the sea level rises up half a foot, 2 feet? Maybe that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you are living on an island or a coastal area, a foot means you can no longer live in those places. Now, sometimes we think, okay, well, Miami, Florida, I guess there's going to be movement inland. Well, for islands and other places in the world, that's not quite so simple. This is also a part of the reasons why people immigrate and things that we have to consider in terms of the morality of immigration, which we are going to talk about in a little while as well. Oftentimes, particularly today, we not only think of economics and absence of economic opportunity, but we also think of violence and war. And that has become very problematic in the 21st century. When we think of the great wars, we think of World War I and we think of World War II. Maybe we even think of Vietnam. These wars where there are, to some degree, maybe not so much Vietnam, but it begins to get a little bit cloudy in Vietnam. But you have one country, one army fighting another country and another army, or multiple armies at the same time. The fighting might encompass areas where people live, or these are areas that exist over there. In Vietnam, as I said, this began to change a little bit, and it became very cloudy as to who might be fighting whom. And today, we have what scholars have called violence in the everyday. In cities where people are going to school and going to work, we have bombings and things like that. Where are people supposed to go? Where are people supposed to live and have children and have families and live out their lives? These are also reasons why people say, okay, enough is enough, and we have to move. This presentation is about raising issues about immigration, but also raising questions to think about when we read the literature of immigration. Question: what is one ready to tolerate and or risk to move? Oftentimes, particularly here, I am in Michigan in the United States, and we think of, we see things, and Michigan is a border state, but it's not the southern border. This is the northern border between Michigan and Canada. But we think of the southern border. We think of countries in Africa. We think of countries in, we think of Afghanistan or in the Middle East, Syria, and those sorts of places. But what are the conditions that facilitate a person, a family, deciding that enough is enough and it is time to move? So what is one ready to tolerate and or risk? If we think about, and these are some, I think, very famous images of the last year or two. We think about these images, and here over my left-hand shoulder is a father and a son that had drowned trying to cross the Rio Grande River. The image over my right shoulder is of a young Syrian child who was caught in a bomb blast, and a very famous photograph of this Syrian child experiencing a kind of flat affect, if you will, shock of being caught. This might facilitate people moving from one place to another. The image in my lower left here is of immigrants from northern Africa occupying a boat that you can see is turning over, trying to get to Cyprus or Greece or southern France. What is one ready to tolerate and or risk? Well, in these photos, there is the risk of death. There is the risk of never seeing one's homeland again. And so those sorts of things are weighed against the potential of better things for the future. What is one ready to tolerate and or risk? Oftentimes it's life. So things to consider. The journey. How is one to leave? Are you going to leave and apply for citizenship or political asylum or different avenues with which to get to a country legally? Or is that not really a possibility? Are you going to take your chances? What might that entail? What about your family members? If you have grandparents or great-grandparents or aunts or uncles, are you going to try to take them with you as well? Are they going to try to immigrate? Is it a possibility? What about the country that you're immigrating to? What kind of laws exist there? And how have, particularly in the last couple of years, how have immigration laws changed? So are you going to try to take the legal route, or are you going to try to just, if the conditions are such that it really doesn't matter, you have to get out of there. There's no more food, there's no more water, there's no more safety, there's no way to raise a family. Are you going to make that choice to travel illegally? What are you going to do for money? What are you going to do for food? All sorts of questions that need to be considered in terms of the characters, in terms of, and I'm speaking because this is an introduction to a series of literary texts that we are going to be reading, but these are things that characters and people in real life consider when making, deciding to make the journey or not. Some various maps. You know, every generation, it seems, has to consider the complexities of immigration. In the last couple of years, this has been highlighted, particularly not only in the United States, but really all over the world. People have been moving for a long period of time. Oftentimes in the United States, when we think about immigration, and the United States is in some ways a little bit different of a case study because it's a much younger country than many other countries around the world, but we often think of immigration beginning, well, it begins with the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the English coming over in the early 17th century. The tides of immigration, the large numbers of people began to come into the United States beginning in the early part of the 19th century, facilitated in Ireland by the potato famine. And in the late 19th century, we have Eastern Europeans and other folks coming over here in larger and larger numbers. When we talk about immigration, we're not just talking about the movement of a person, a family, or a group of people from one country to another. We're also talking about migrating patterns within a country. The map over my left-hand shoulder is a migratory map, if you will, of in the post-bellum period, late 19th century America. Emancipated slaves, an absence of economic opportunities in the South, moved to the major, some of the major urban centers of the North, like Pittsburgh and Detroit and Boston and New York. So this has been going on for a very long period of time. The map on the right-hand side here is a current map of large amounts of people moving all over the world today. And I have some statistics, and there's a whole body of statistics that suggests to us, and what I'm trying to present to you, and again, a large number of statistics, a few of them here, and statistics that you can find, is that there's a large number of people moving around the world all the time for all of these different reasons. How much movement? 68.5 million men, women, and children are escaping war, persecution, and political turbulence yearly. About 258 million people, or 1 in every 30, are living outside their country of origin. This is from 2017. A discussion of immigration is inherently political. And politics creep up in my literature classes. We touch on politics often, and I think they creep up, maybe creep is not the best word, but they become a part of the conversation, more so when we're talking about the literature of immigration. Immigration is political. It's a group of people leaving, often in part because of political reasons, going to another country that has to accept them or reconcile them in all sorts of different ways. And we've seen in the United States in the last couple of years, well, not just the United States, but all over the world, both an embrace of immigrants moving from one country to another and a rejection. And we have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? Why is this happening? What does this have to do with our politics? What does this have to do with our understanding of how we treat people, one another in the world today? Things for us to consider. And I want to emphasize that, when we're talking about immigration in the 18th century or the 19th century or the early 20th century, there are a lot of similarities between immigration today, and there are some differences, certainly. When people were leaving in the 18th or 19th century, early 20th century, you'd be going on a voyage that would take a long period of time, sometimes weeks, to get from one country to another. In my own family, parts of my family came from the Ukraine and came from Russia in the early 20th century. And sort of the anecdotal story in my family is that my great-grandfather, whom I knew until he died when I was about 15 or 16 years old, he walked from the Ukraine to the United Kingdom. Walked from the Ukraine to the United Kingdom, took months. And when he got to the United Kingdom, he got on a boat and came to New York, and on the boat he met my great-grandmother. He never went back to Europe. The world today is a much smaller place because of technology. And yet at the same time, even though many immigrants in the 19th and early 20th century never had the opportunity to go back to their native countries, even today when people leave, it is often forever. Things for us to consider. That the immigrant is leaving the familiar to the unfamiliar. So even though we have technology, even though McDonald's is in every corner of the world and things like that, the immigrant is leaving a place that they might have grown up in, that they have memories of, and that these memories are just going to be places in one's mind that they have to think about, but physical places that they can never go back to. We might be thinking about family disintegration, the history of one's family if family members are left behind. What does that mean for the family that is left behind? What does that mean for the immigrant that comes to a new country? We have to think about assimilation versus cultural retention. Are pockets of immigrants in various communities, do they become targets for anti-immigrant sentiment? Are immigrants assimilated, whatever that might mean, assimilated into culture? The history, the language, practices. We've seen in our country, in the United States, in the last couple of years, renewed movements of racism, nativism, and white nationalism. What does this mean for those that are moving to a new country? What does this mean for the existing community? Why are these feelings being facilitated? And how can our government intervene? So we have to consider politics, nationalism, community, community within a small geographical and political space, a region, state, nation. What does it mean? What does it mean on the national level when you have a country that says refugees are welcome? What does it mean when you have another country that says refugees are not welcome? Consider the psychological effects, trauma. How about in terms of identity? Do you have an identity of the new country? Have you been brought over to a new country and have been raised as, let's say, an American? Whatever that might mean, that's also a handful for us to define. What about the language, the culture, the history of the country that your family had come from? And I want to talk just for a moment about language. In the last few years, and this is not just been in the last few years, but this is sort of endemic to the question of immigration and language. Is it important that a new immigrant or an immigrant family, when they go to a new country, is it important that they learn what may be a new language? Yeah, I think that it is important. It helps one navigate, read the signs, order things on a carryout menu, better integration perhaps into schools. But is maintaining and learning, if a second-generation immigrant, is it important to maintain another language? I think that's also important. And I think in our very understanding of what language is and what language is acceptable, we often find at its foundation, a racist ideology. What do I mean by that? Well, today, if you looking in the news, and the news is dominated by, by coronavirus and other things today. But, how many times have we heard in the last couple of years that two people are speaking Spanish at a Walmart, let's say. This is just one story that I've heard, or that I've read about. Two people speaking Spanish at a Walmart, and somebody chastises them. Comes up to them and says, "You shouldn't be speaking that language." Why not? Why can't people speak the language that they want? Isn't speaking multiple languages a good thing? Well, I think that it is. So what does it mean that somebody says you cannot speak Spanish here? Do we hear that same thing about two people speaking French? I haven't heard any stories about people being accosted for speaking French, or going to a French bakery and ordering a millefeuille in French or whatnot. So what does it mean about the perception? And I'm talking about the nativist or racist perceptions that people might have against somebody speaking Spanish or Arabic versus somebody speaking French. I think these things need to be considered. Ultimately, I think that immigration brings up a larger conversation about human responsibility and morality. That we have to consider if we agree that human life has value. What are we willing to do to save people? And I think in this conversation, we have to talk about difference as well, and the ways with which difference and immigration has changed historically over the years. You know, when we think about immigrants, and historically, when immigrants came to the United States in the 19th century, immigrants may look different. They may wear different clothes. They may eat different foods. They may smell different. They may listen to different music. Ultimately, I think, people are the same. I think that if you give a person, give a family, the opportunity to eat food, to have enough food to eat, educational opportunities, to have a roof over their head, maybe a little bit of money, like in the old days when people could go to the movie theater. Then I think a lot of these differences and the ways that people all around the world have been drawing lines in the sand, I think those lines in the sand would disappear. And in the 19th century in the United States, people came over and they first came from Europe and Eastern Europe. And then, you know, in Eastern Europe there were Bulgarians and Romanians and Orthodox Jews. And people looked different. There were also Italians that came over in some of the first waves of immigration. And when Italians came over, there was a kind of rejection against Italian immigrants. They looked different than Americans. Again, difficult to define. But Americans that were here, Italians looked different. And then these Eastern Europeans began to come over that looked different than the Italians. And after a period of time, the Italians didn't seem all that different to people that were living here. They seemed more white. And those people looked different. So I think in many ways our reaction to the immigrant is a fear of the other, that is often the basis of racist ideology. And again, this sort of engages a larger conversation about human responsibility and human morality. So whether we are looking at a text like Mary Anton's The Promised Land or Edith Maud Eaton's Miss Spring Fragrance, Abraham Cahane's The Imported Bridegroom, for instance, or texts that my students are going to be looking at very shortly, Mahim Hamad's Exit West. These are all the sorts of considerations that we have to think about in these characters that leave from one country to another. What are the sorts of decisions that they are weighing, that these characters are weighing, that people weigh? And in terms of how are they going to be accepted and perceived in the various countries that they end up moving to. Okay, thank you very much.